So white women supported Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. He won 52% of their votes. Though when you look at all women, including women of color, Hillary Clinton had more support. She got 54%. Now a wave of women, white, black, and brown, sweeping into office after the 2018 election. Does Donald Trump still have the support of a majority of white women? And if so, why is that? Let's talk about it. Here to discuss, Kirsten Powers, Alice Stewart, and Stephanie Jones-Rogers. She is a professor of history at UC Berkeley and the author of They Were Her Property. Hello, one and all. This is a very important conversation, and I'm sure it's going to stir up some controversy in a number of different quarters, so be prepared for that. So thank you for joining us. Kirsten, I'm going to start with you. There's been a lot of talk about why white women support President Trump despite of, or perhaps because of, his policies and his tone. What's your take on this?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways that we have to look at this. I think one of the first things is that people will say that they support him for reasons other than his racist language, which we don't have time to go through, but there's all sorts of things starting from the launch of his campaign all the way up until the latest campaign, the way he demonized people trying to come to our country on the caravan. And they'll say, well, I'm not racist. I just voted for him because, I didn't like Hillary Clinton. And I just want to say that that doesn't make you not racist. It actually makes you racist. If you support somebody who does racist things, that makes you racist. So I just want to establish that. As for why white women do it, I think we have to recognize that white men are doing it as well, but I think sometimes we would hope that we would get better behavior from white women because white women are themselves oppressed and that they would therefore be able to align themselves with other oppressed people. But I think we have to remember that the white patriarchal system actually benefits white women in a lot of ways. And they're attached to white men who are benefiting from the system that was created by them, for them. And their fathers and their husbands and their brothers are benefiting from the system. And so they are also benefiting.
I just want to read something. It's from a Vox article, and it says that the war on crime has been pitched as an effort to keep white women safe. White women have been the plaintiffs in some lawsuits against affirmative action, and conservatives have argued that the practice harms white women, even though research has shown that white women have been some of the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action. It shows you there the contradiction when you actually really think about the policies. People will say that that white women are actually voting against their own interests. I'm not sure if that is true, because maybe the better interest to them is what they get from voting for people like President Trump and Republicans. Stephanie, you're quoted in this Fox article saying, for centuries, white women have invested in white supremacy because their whiteness affords them a particular kind of power that their gender does not. Explain what you mean by that.
So as a historian, I explore white women's economic investments in the institution of slavery, and what that has led me to understand is that there's this broader historical context that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at white women's voting patterns today. And as we look at their support, their overwhelming support of Donald Trump. And so what I meant was that we tend to think of white women as primarily focusing on their gendered oppression, that because they are oppressed as women, that oppression will allow for them to ally and to sympathize with other dispossessed and disempowered peoples in the nation. But my research actually shows that they long had a deep investment in white supremacy, and not only did they benefit from it, but they participated in its construction and its perpetuation, not just in the context of slavery, not just in the colonial period, but well after slavery was over.
You said that it was overwhelming. It's 52%. It is a majority, but it's 52%. It's not overwhelming, but it is a majority.
Well, what I meant by overwhelming was emotionally, emotionally overwhelming.
Got it.
And the response that we've.
So Alice, why do you think that white women support President Trump? Do you think they identify more with being, as she said, white than they do with being female? She just said that.
I think when we're talking about the political arena, voters, women and men, identify themselves as either Republican, Democrat, Independent, or whatever their political party. And I strongly disagree with the characterization that women are oppressed, and by nature of that oppression, they should naturally vote for another group of people that are oppressed. I think that's just not how politics works. I think as a Republican or a Democrat or whatever your political leanings is, you should vote for people that represent those policies. I'm a Republican. I support this president. I voted for this president. I did so because of his policies. I do not agree with his tone and tenor. Don, I've been on your show dozens and dozens of times discounting his behavior, his tone, his tactics, the things he says about women, his denigrating women, and I don't tolerate that. But his policies are what I stand for.
But isn't that
and
part
Don,
of the policies? Is that not part of the policies?
No, they're not, Don. The two, they're separate. Look, I worked really hard for a candidate that had the character befitting of this office. Unfortunately, he didn't win the will of the Republican Party to become the nominee, and I supported Donald Trump's policies over Hillary Clinton's. And let me just say this, Kirsten is a dear friend of mine, but I resent the fact that she says that I'm racist because Donald Trump says racist things. I support this president because of his policies, and the things that he says that are disparaging and disgusting, which I've said many times, those don't represent me.
But Alice, you don't have to support him. You could not vote. I mean, that's the thing. I could say there's a Democrat who does everything that I agree with, but they say misogynist or racist thing. I would not vote for them. And I just want to step back for a second and say, look, we spent a lot of time talking about Republican women. Look, there's a problem with white women. It doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans or nothing. There's a problem with racism. Every white person benefits from an inherently racist system that is structurally racist. So we're all part of the problem. So I'm not trying to point my finger at you or at another person, but I think we have to recognize that there's institutional racism in this country. And by saying I'm just going to support somebody who you just said says racist things and does racist things is a problem.
And if I could add to that, and just a point of clarification. So I did not say that white women voted for Trump because they were racist. What I actually said was that there's this broader historical context in which white supremacy is quite important to white women, not simply as the kind of beneficiaries of white supremacy, but as orchestrators, part of the builders of white supremacy. So just to clarify that, and I agree totally with what Kristen said. This is not about simply conservative white women. This is a phenomenon that is spread across the country, whether in the South or the North. You can see that this is, and it's not an indictment against all white women. This is about a certain percentage of these white women who do indeed vote for a man who is certainly not speaking to their interests as women or as human beings.
Yeah.
Let me just be honest about it, as human beings.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. All right, we're back now with Kirsten Ellis and Stephanie Jones-Rogers. So, listen, you guys made the distinction. You said that we shouldn't be talking about Republican women versus Democratic women. It's all white. We were talking about white women here. But I have to point this out. I want you to check out. This is the new Democratic members of Congress compared to the new Republican members of Congress. All white, one female. And, I mean, Alice, what draws you to President Trump and this Republican Party? Look at the diversity here. It is unquestionable. There's a lack of diversity on the Republican side, and one woman.
There's no question about that. And the thing that jumps out at me, certainly the racial component that we see there, but the gender component. Democrats did a much better job of recruiting women. In the House alone, they had 6 times more women elected to the House of Representatives, and in the Senate, they had 5 times more women elected to the Senate. And overall, I'm pleased to see that we had more than almost 130 women elected to the House and Senate and in governor's positions. But yes, Democrats did a better job of recruiting women.
Doesn't that say something about the party? It's more than just recruiting. Doesn't it say something about the party? Maybe people think it's just sort of radioactive women, I should say. I don't really want to be attracted to that, yet they do most of the time vote. Not minority women, but go on, sorry.
there's two different distinctions here. There's women voters, and then there's women that will take the courage and put their livelihood on the line and actually run for office, which I have the most respect for them. Republicans did a better job of recruiting them. And look, I'll be the first to admit that some of the tone and tenor of this presidency did encourage a lot of people on the left to get in and run for office because they were frustrated and they were mad about the current situation that we have in Washington, D.C. And I think that motivated a lot of people on the left. Now the Republicans need to go out and recruit women to get involved because we do need a more diverse representation in Washington.
Well, and also probably, you said the tone and tenor, they need to work on that aspect of it as well.
No
so,
doubt.
Kirsten, listen, we had this conversation after the whole Megyn Kelly blackface controversy, and you wrote a piece about how white women often whitewash racism, you say. Talk about that. How big of a problem is it?
It's a huge problem, and I think, you know, it's something that I think a lot of white women aren't aware of, and again, people might be also saying, why are we picking on white women? There's white men too, and to a certain extent, I think it's because of what I said before. There's an idea that because white women experience their own oppression, that they would have, you know, more of a connection and an affinity with other people who are oppressed, and so I think it's that much more upsetting. I also think it's because of some of the history that we've heard about before, that there is a long history of white women being responsible for black men being lynched, for example, for making accusations against them. And we see a lot of this, we see similar types of things happening. It's not as extreme, but when you see white women over and over, I mean, it's constantly happening where they're calling the police on black men who are gardening, a little black boy in a convenience store, these kinds of things, knowing full well that when you call the police on a black man, that he could end up dead. And so it's a very similar kind of thinking that I don't think people see this kind of parallels that are happening in our society. And so I think that, you know, all white women, not just conservative white women, need to sort of take a step back and really look at, you know, what kind of how they're being participants in this system and what they can do to try and change the system.
Stephanie, can you talk to me about this? Because I heard Alice said something, but I didn't want to interrupt her flow last time. She said that women, this was her estimation, correct me if I'm wrong, Alice, but she said she didn't think women were oppressed. And I found that interesting. Is that part of this whole conversation about what privilege is it in the society, that as a white woman, maybe a Republican woman, that she doesn't necessarily feel oppressed? Is that talk to me about that, Stephanie?
Well, I think that's really interesting because in my own work, what I show is that while white women may be oppressed because of the legal constraints placed upon them by white men, as women, they aren't able to exercise certain rights in the colonial and 19th century context. But at the same time, they're able to dominate, subjugate, and own enslaved people. So while they're oppressed in one realm or one dimension of their lives, they are, you know, quite powerful in another very important dimension of their lives.
You're talking about historically. You meant historically in the past.
Yes,
You're talking about slavery.
In the context of the current atmosphere, you can certainly be oppressed, but also be powerful at the same time. So I think those things can go hand in hand. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think, you know, she can be right, but also there are other women who would disagree.
So you're saying that there are different levels. You can be there's a glass ceiling, or you can be part of the Me Too movement at work, but you're still more powerful than the women of color in the society, so therefore you may not see it as much. Go ahead, Alice, do you want to respond to that?
No, I think this, you know, with all due respect, I take issue with the white privilege argument. I come from a broken home with abuse and alcoholism, and been on my own since I was 18, paid my own way through school, so I'm hardly the poster child of white privilege. So I think a lot of times what we do is we look at things through the racial lens or the gender lens, when in all actuality, we also need to look at it through the socioeconomic lens and the class lens and the financial status of people. I think that is a lot more determining factor with people's political leanings, how they vote.
Can I just tell you the difference real quick, Alice? And no one's denying, you know, people have their struggles and they overcome it. And I actually respect that you made something of yourself. But even with that, you didn't have to deal with historic and systemic racism, which is a huge, huge problem and a huge block in this society. You can be the best person of color as far as smarts and have a background in college and still not go any higher than someone who is not educated and white, someone who doesn't understand things as much and maybe not as smart and not as talented. That is simply fact in this society, but you don't have to think about that because you're not a minority and you don't have to face racism. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Can I also just add to that? I just think
I want her to let her respond, and I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Donna, I'm never going to claim or of a different race. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think
let me put it this way before you respond. So my mother, who has a master's degree, almost a doctorate, in the 1970s, when she went to her job at a very big company, she could only become a secretary. And there were white women who were coming in from trade schools who were becoming secretaries to the plant manager, or who came in at something higher than a secretary, who came in as managers, didn't have as much education as her, were not as smart as her. And it wasn't until the end of her career where there started to be some balance that she started to see the success of white women. And so no one thinks about that when you're not dealing with it. When you're participating in the process and you're reaping the benefit from it, you can come from equal levels of economics. One white family, one black family. And historically, the studies will show that the white person will rise faster, will make more money, and will get opportunities more so. There are exceptions, but if you don't have to deal with it, you don't have to think about it. Sorry, go on.
No, I didn't know if Kirsten was talking. Look, as I said, Donna, I commend your mother. Certainly, she was a strong woman and raised a tremendous son. Look, I said I cannot understand what it is like to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. That's not what I'm saying. I think the question is, and the concern I have is people automatically assuming just because you're of a certain race or a certain gender that you automatically have a leg up on society, and that is not always the case. That's the way I view it, and that's in part of this conversation. I'm not saying I understand what it's like in someone else's shoes. That's how I view this situation.
And I think that that's a great thing that Alice brought up, because I think that's the misunderstanding. It's not, when people hear privilege, they think that that means I'm like a Richie Rich and I'm living a really rich life. That's not what it means. It just means that you have a privilege that people of color don't have. And so in certain situations, like what Don was talking about, there's also systemic and institutional racism that you don't even see. And so an example would be standardized tests were created by white men for white men, and there's actually plenty of studies have been done on the history of them, that they were actually made to discriminate against people of color. So that's something that you don't even realize. You don't even, as a white person, you don't even realize that the tests have been skewed in favor of you to help you get into a better college. Yeah. That's the way that it started. And so there's all these things that are happening. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Quick, Stephanie, sorry, and not to give you short shrift, and then I'm out of time. Go on, Steph.
Yeah. When we talk about white privilege, you can just imagine that the poorest white woman in this country can call the cops on a black person and be believed. So that's the kind of white privilege that we can also talk about here, not as Kirsten said, the Richie Rich.
So listen, I think these are important conversations. People often refer to them as difficult. I don't think they're difficult. I think we should just continue to talk like this and be as open and honest with each other as possible. That's the only way there's going to be progress. So I commend each of you for coming on and discussing this. I'd love to have you back. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
happy Thanksgiving to all of your wonderful families, and even you, Kirsten. I'm kidding. All right. We'll be right back.
Bye.